The house lay heavy with a hush that evening, a softness that seemed to settle into my bones. After a week that had worn me thin, I welcomed the quiet like a balm. I moved through the small ritual of changing into pajamas and then collapsed under the covers, trusting the night to hold me. For 8 years I'd been raising my son, Daniel, alone. The divorce had not been punctuated by fireworks or fury, only a gradual unspooling, 2 lives that slowly no longer fit together. Raising Daniel by myself had been the richest, most exhausting work of my life. He filled me with pride, quick-witted, generous, often saying or doing things that made my heart swell. Yet playing both parents was fatiguing in ways that never ceased to surprise me. Still, we'd built a life that felt steady and true. Moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, sketching pale, shifting patterns across the walls. I lay under the blanket and let my thoughts drift, grateful for this softer chapter after a difficult year. Even at nearly 20, Daniel carried a kind of tenderness that sometimes made me worry he took on more than he should. I smiled at the memory of him, his jokes, his small mercies, and the feeling pulled me toward sleep. A soft knock at my bedroom door tugged me back from the brink of dreams. For a moment I thought it was a figment of sleep, but the sound came again, patient and muffled. "Mom," Daniel whispered. I blinked toward the doorway, where his silhouette stood framed in the faint hallway light. I sat up, trying to rub away the last threads of drowsiness. "Daniel? What is it?" My voice came out small and still wrapped in sleep. He hesitated at the threshold, then slipped inside, closing the door with a careful, almost furtive motion. He paused as if measuring whether crossing into my room meant crossing some quiet boundary, then moved toward the bed. "I can't sleep," he said, looking down. There was a weariness in his face, not just ordinary tiredness, but a heavier, shadowed kind of trouble, and it tightened something inside me. He'd had nights like these since the separation, times when his mind would not ease, though he rarely let us see how hard it landed on him. "Come here," I said, patting the space beside me. "You can stay." He took a moment, then climbed in and curled up on his side facing me. In the thin silver light his posture looked less guarded, more exposed than he usually allowed himself to be. I tucked a loose strand of hair behind his ear and drew the blanket up to his shoulders. "Do you want to talk?" I asked. He shook his head and let his hair fall across his eyes.
"No."
"I just wanted to be near you," he murmured, as small and private as a confession. The admission lodged warmly in my chest. It had been a long time since he'd needed this kind of closeness. I rested my hand on his shoulder and felt the slow, steady cadence of his breathing begin to calm. "That's fine," I told him. "Stay as long as you need." We lay together in companionable quiet. The hush of the house wrapped around us, and I thought he had drifted into sleep, his breaths deepening, the soft rise and fall beneath the blanket. Then, barely above a murmur, he spoke again. "Mom," he asked, as if testing the shape of the question, "do you ever miss him?" The question hit harder than I expected. It was an ache I'd kept in the background since the separation, something I skirted around but rarely let myself say straight out. I felt the familiar tug at my throat and answered honestly. "Sometimes," I admitted after a pause. "I miss parts of what we had. But things weren't right between us." He nodded without looking at me. Silence settled, full of old, complicated histories, small kindnesses and careless cruelties, the quiet erosion that had brought us to this place. There was no need to press. Those words needed only to hang between us and do their quiet work. For a while, we simply listened to the night, the slow hush of the house, the whisper of the blanket, our breaths keeping time. In that gentle darkness, the sharper edges of loss seemed less raw. Daniel shifted, his shoulder brushing mine, and a fierce gratitude rose up inside me for the life we'd made, imperfect but intimate, precarious yet true. Outside, the moon slid on. Inside the bed, bounded by the blanket and one another, we let the dark hold us until sleep began to come. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" he asked after a while. I let out a slow breath. The question pulled old regrets back into the room. "Sometimes," I said, measured. But we can't change what's already happened. We have to keep moving forward. My voice steadied on the last words, firmer than the feeling inside me. Daniel picked at the hem of the blanket and stared at his hands. I just wonder if maybe I could have done something, he said. Like if I'd been better. His words fell like small stones into the quiet. I turned to him immediately. No, I said, quick and certain. This wasn't your fault. You didn't cause any of it. My voice softened then, urgent to free him of that weight. He looked away. His next words were barely audible. Sometimes it feels like if I'd been better, Dad wouldn't have left. A hotness rose behind my eyes. I pulled him into my arms. For a beat he stiffened, uncertain whether to accept the embrace. Then he folded into me, his face pressed against my shoulder. The sorrow he carried settled into my chest as if it were mine to hold. Listen, I said, my voice thin with feeling. Your father made his own choices. It had nothing to do with you. That was on him, not you. He trembled slightly in my arms, and I felt the slow loosening of a tension I'd held for years, something taut and raw easing under the steady pressure of being known. We remained like that for a long time, two bodies curled together beneath the blanket, sharing warmth and silence and the small, steady assurance of presence. The night kept its hush, and with my hand on his back, I waited while sleep finally gathered us both into its dark, ordinary kindness. The night had folded itself quiet around the house, a stillness that seemed to press gently against my skin. After the kind of week that left me hollowed out, I welcomed the hush like a refuge. I changed into pajamas with the small mechanical motions of someone too tired to think, slid under the covers, and let myself float toward sleep. For 8 years I had been Daniel's soul keeper. The divorce had not been a single violent rupture, only the slow unwinding of two lives that no longer fit together. Raising him alone had been the most rewarding and the most draining work of my life. He was clever and kind, the sort of son who made my chest swell with pride for the little mercies he handed out without thinking. Still, shouldering both roles wore on me in ways I rarely admitted. Even so, what we had built felt steady and true. Moonlight sifted through the curtains and sketched pale patterns across the walls. I lay there, rooted by the blanket and the quiet, letting my thoughts drift over memories and small satisfactions. Daniel, at nearly 20, still kept a gentleness about him that sometimes made me worry he took on too much. I smiled at a private recollection, one of his jokes, some tiny grace, and began to slip into sleep. A soft knock at my door pulled me back, sharp and punctual. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it, but then his voice whispered, "Mom." There he was in the doorframe, a shadow in the hallway light. I sat up, the last threads of sleep loosening from my thoughts. "What is it, Daniel?" My voice was raw with tiredness. He lingered at the threshold as if deciding whether to cross into my small, private world. When he came in, he closed the door with quiet hands and moved toward the bed with a body that seemed more weary than his years should allow. "I can't sleep," he said without looking at me. There was a weight in his expression, something that carried both a kind of tiredness and a deeper worry, and it pinched my heart. He'd had nights like this since the separation, restless, silent, carrying things inside that he rarely let out. "Come here," I said, patting the mattress. "Stay if you need to." He hesitated a beat and then curled up beside me, facing inward as if to keep whatever troubles he had close and safe. In the silver light his features softened, and his usual reserve seemed to drop away. I smoothed his hair back and drew the blanket up around his shoulders. "Do you want to talk?" I asked. "No," he answered softly, hair falling over his eyes. "I just wanted to be near you." The smallness of the admission lodged warm and aching in my chest. It had been a long time since he needed that kind of nearness. I put my hand on his shoulder and felt his breathing slow. "That's okay," I said. "Stay as long as you want." We lay together, a quiet rhythm settling between us. I thought he had drifted off. His breaths deepened and evened. Then, as if testing a thought against the dark, he said, "Do you ever miss him?" The question landed deeper than I expected. It was the kind of thing I had skirted around since the divorce, a tender ache I preferred not to name aloud. I let the truth out quietly. Sometimes, I said, I miss parts of what we had. But things weren't right. He nodded, staring somewhere beyond the edge of the bed. The silence that followed was full of history, of small mercies, thoughtless cruelties, the cumulative where that led to breakup. There was no need to press. Those words needed only to hang between us and do their work. We listened to the house breathe, the faint creak of settling boards, the whisper of fabric. In that easy darkness, the sharp edges of absence seemed dulled. Daniel shifted closer. His shoulder touched mine, and I felt a rush of fierce gratitude for the life we'd managed to make, messy and loving. Outside, the moon moved on. Under the blanket, in the hush of our shared breathing, sleep came. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" he asked later, as if the question had been incubating in the dark. I exhaled slowly. Sometimes, I admitted. But we can't change what's already happened. We have to keep going. My voice sounded firmer than my heart felt. He stared at his hands, picking at the blanket hem. "I wonder if I could have done something," he said, voice small. "If I'd been better." The words landed like stones. I turned to him immediately. "No," I said, sharp and urgent. "This wasn't your fault. You didn't cause it." My tone softened as I wrapped the truth around him. He looked away, then, quieter still, he said, "Sometimes it feels like if I'd been better, Dad wouldn't have left." Heat rose behind my eyes. I gathered him into my arms. At first he stiffened, unsure whether to accept the comfort. Then he folded in, his face nestling at my collarbone. The sorrow he carried settled in my chest as if it were mine. "Listen to me," I said, voice breaking with earnestness. "Your father made his choices. That was on him, not on you. You have always been more than enough." I let those words rest between us, over and over, until his breathing grew regular and soft. We held each other in that quiet. Minutes stretched and unspooled, his body loosening as the tension left him. Eventually the shallow, even sleep claimed him, and I stayed awake longer, thoughts drifting in the dark. We had weathered so much, the loyalty and love, the losses and the quiet compromises, and a fierce want to keep him free of burdens settled over me. But as night thinned toward dawn, a feeling rose that I could not tidy into a neat label. It began as a subtle warmth, a tenderness that turned inward in a direction that surprised me. At first I called it relief, fatigue, the simple comfort of proximity. Yet it hummed, an insistence that would not quite be dismissed. I admonished myself, he is my son. That certainty steadied me, and I clung to it, but the other sensation, a whisper of connection that did not sit comfortably in the categories I knew, hovered at the edges like a half-seen shape I could not place. Morning arrived sooner than I wanted. Pale light washed the room and softened Daniel's features. He looked unburdened, as though a heavy thing had been lifted. He was handsome in the morning glow, his face relaxed of the earlier tension. Pride swelled in me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and went downstairs to make breakfast. The small rituals of the kitchen, measuring coffee, the hiss of batter on the griddle, gave me something solid to hold. Still, the night tugged at my thoughts. I understood, with a fresh, aching clarity, how deeply he had internalized his father's leaving. The guilt he bore haunted me more than anything. I would have borne it myself if I could have. But it was not only his sorrow that clung to my mind. It was the look he had given me in the half-dark, the raw openness he had allowed. That vulnerability had sparked something strange and tender in me, an intimacy I hadn't expected and didn't know how to name. I reminded myself firmly of the boundary between us. That truth felt necessary, anchoring. Yet the other feeling, the quiet murmur of connection that did not fit, refused to dissolve. It hovered at the edges of my attention, puzzling and unwelcome, and I spent the morning bargaining with it like someone trying to decide whether a shadow belonged to a tree or to a person. When Daniel finally padded downstairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes, the day's routines were in place. Coffee steamed on the counter, and the plates were warm. I greeted him with a smile and a plate of pancakes, working at normalcy even as a current of unease ran under my ordinary gestures. He took his seat and began to eat. The morning light threw dust motes into a slow, golden shower. Now and then I felt his glance on me, curious, searching, but I kept the night's talk to myself. He seemed steadier, more himself, and I did not want to unsettle whatever fragile peace had settled between us. "Thanks for last night, Mom," he said at last, his voice softer than the clatter of cutlery. "I really needed that." His gratitude stopped me. "You never need to thank me," I told him. "I'll always be here." He nodded, eyes holding an unspoken question, a more intense longing for closeness than the usual script allowed. A part of me, the part one did not want to admit, recognized that longing. After breakfast he lingered, the habit of waking slowly still in him. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" he asked, the old hurt threading his tone. "Maybe," I said quietly. "But we can't change the past. We move forward as best we can." He looked down at his hands. "Sometimes I think if I'd been better," his voice broke on the thought. I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder, pulling him into an embrace. He stiffened for a heartbeat, then relaxed, pressing his face to my chest. "You didn't do anything wrong," I said, intent on rinsing away his blame. "This was his decision. It wasn't yours. You have always been enough." He exhaled a breath that sounded like both relief and sleep. I held him, feeling that familiar flow of maternal love, but beneath it a warmth that didn't fit neatly into mothering began to stir again. I told myself it was exhaustion, the afterglow of having kept him safe. Still it lingered at the edges of my awareness. As the morning moved on, I busied myself with the day while that small, disquieting feeling continued to hover, unlabeled, unwelcome, and persistent. The memory of his vulnerability in the dim room kept returning, and I found myself watching him with a protectiveness sharpened into something I could not yet define. I folded plates, wiped counters, and let the ordinary tasks try to iron the wrinkle of unease flat. But under the domestic calm, questions had been laid down, and I knew I needed to reckon with them before they changed the shape of the life we had so carefully constructed. The memory of the look he'd given me at dawn, open, tender, searching, kept returning, and each time it unsettled me more. I told myself sharply, "He is my son." That reminder steadied me, a hard-edged truth against the softer whisper that had taken up residence at the edges of my thoughts. Still, the whisper did not go away. When Daniel came down again, rubbing the last sleep from his eyes, I set an extra plate on the table and offered a smile. He ate with a hunger that felt ordinary and reassuring, the simple ballast of day-to-day life. We traded small, practical talk about classes and what he needed to take with him. The words were light, but each line carried the shadow of what had been said and left unspoken the night before. At one point he looked up and searched my face. The unasked question hovered between us like glass, transparent, fragile, not yet to be touched. There was tenderness in his gaze and something sharper beneath it, an intensity that made the familiar line between us tremble. We let that question stay unwritten. We kept to our usual motions, measuring coffee, folding napkins, checking the clock, while inside me an uneasy awareness quietly gathered itself strength. As the day moved on, Daniel retreated to his room to do homework and sink into the refuge of video games. The house resumed its ordinary cadence. I stood by the sink, the warmth of sudsy water seeping into my hands, and tried to put my thoughts in order. We had crossed some invisible threshold that night, an imperceptible shift that had altered the balance between us. Fear braided itself to a strange, reluctant anticipation, fear of what naming this might demand, and a cautious curiosity about where such change could lead. I made a quiet resolution to protect him and to protect the fragile truth of who we were. Whatever had stirred in me would need careful watching and containment. For the moment, I would be the steady presence he needed, the safe harbor. When the time came, I would face whatever questions the night had opened. Until that time, I folded another pancake, set a plate on the table, and kept my voice light when I asked, "Do you need anything before you go?" The uneasy whisper inside me refused to die down. Evening came, and Daniel emerged from his room, hair still rumpled, his lanky frame carrying the last traces of adolescence. But something had shifted. There was a new steadiness in his eyes, an adult gravity that suggested the boy I had known was quietly stepping aside for the man on his way. I tried to hide the residue of the night with a smile. "Morning, sleepyhead," I said, placing a stack of golden pancakes in front of him. "Thanks," he mumbled, settling in. We ate in an easy silence that seemed to know the rhythm of our lives, sunlight softening the edges of the kitchen and turning dust motes into drifting gold. I caught his glance now and then, curious and tentative, and kept the late-night conversation to myself. He seemed steadier, less raw, and I didn't want to fracture whatever fragile truce had settled over us. After the dishes and a half-hearted exchange of small talk, the afternoon slid into its familiar chores. Daniel disappeared into his room for homework and games while I folded laundry and scrubbed counters, but the house felt different. A low current of tension thrummed under every ordinary task. The closeness that had come in the night had shifted something between us, subtle and seismic at once. The more I thought about it, the more I acknowledged that my feelings had moved beyond the familiar shore of maternal love into waters I could not chart. That evening, after dinner, we sank onto the couch to watch a movie. The room was dim, the television's light stuttering across the walls. We began with the comfortable quiet of two people who have lived together long enough to fit in each other's silence. As the film ran, I became acutely aware of him beside me, the gentle brush of his arm, the warmth of his shoulder close by. My heart, unbidden, began to thud. Midway through the movie, he shifted closer, pressing further into the space between us. This time he did not pull away. When his arm brushed mine and stayed, a small electric current ran through me. I glanced at him and found his eyes meeting mine. Wide, open, charged with an intensity one had not seen before. Without thinking, I reached for his hand. Our fingers interlaced as naturally as inhaling. He didn't resist, he squeezed, his thumb tracing slow circles on my skin. The gesture felt innocent and intimate all at once. It made my pulse flutter, familiar in its warmth and unsettling in its newness. We sat like that for a long time, palms clasped in the dark, a quiet, wordless witness to a changing pattern. It felt like a turning point, not a sudden proclamation, but a soft, mutual acknowledgement that something had altered. The movie ended, and the credits rolled by unnoticed. I rested my head on his shoulder and felt the steady cadence of his breath beside my ear. His presence soothed me, but it also carried a current I could not name. "Mom," he whispered, barely audible. "I'm really glad you were there last night." "I'm glad you came," I answered simply. The words were small but deep, holding the gratitude and relief I felt, and the more complicated feelings I couldn't yet speak aloud. As the night deepened, that same trembling awareness returned, an anxious, anticipatory feeling that made the boundary between us feel paper-thin. The realization scared me. The relationship I had defined my whole adult life might be shifting into territory I had never intended to travel. Yet along with the fear there was a strange sense of possibility, an acknowledgement that this might be the beginning of something neither of us fully understood. When sleep finally took us, dawn came gently. Daniel lay beside me, face relaxed and relieved. I watched him for a long while, my chest full of protective love. Yet beneath that love another current persisted, the same unfamiliar sensation that had stirred in the living room, a warmth and closeness that blurred the neat categories I had long relied on. I rose quietly, careful not to wake him, and went downstairs to make breakfast. The morning rituals steadied me, batter sizzling, coffee steaming, the house settling into the ordinary rhythms of a new day. The memory of his confession kept returning to me, the guilt he'd carried over his father's leaving, the way he'd sought comfort in my arms. The weight of that hurt made me want to wrap him in protection forever. Oddly, his vulnerability also woke something tender inside me that felt unlike the usual fierce, practical maternal instinct. I scolded myself aloud, "He is my son," and clung to that assertion like a lifeline. Still, A quiet whisper of feeling lingered at the edges of my awareness. When Daniel patted downstairs, hair mussed and rubbing the last sleep from his eyes, I set an extra plate on the table and smiled. He ate with a hunger that grounded us in everyday life, coffee warming our hands, the scrape of cutlery, the small practical talk about classes and what needed fixing around the house. Between those ordinary sentences, though, there hovered a fragile recognition. Something had shifted between us, however quietly, and the map of our relationship no longer fit as neatly as it once had. He retreated to his room later, headphones on and thumbs flying across a controller, and the house slid into its familiar hum. I stood at the sink, warm water running over my hands, and tried to gather my thoughts. Fear and a strange, reluctant excitement braided themselves inside me. I knew I must watch and contain what had stirred, to protect him and to safeguard the family we'd made. Denial would not make the feeling disappear. So I resolved, for now, to remain present and steady, the harbor he could always come back to. I would keep being his mother, practical, fierce, and constant. When the moment came that required more honesty, I would face it. Until then, I folded another towel, put it on the shelf, and called out in an even tone, "Do you need anything else before you go?" That evening, when we sank onto the couch to watch a movie, the closeness from the night before lingered like a warm thread. Daniel shifted now and then, his arm grazing mine, and each small touch landed in me with a tenderness that felt, at first, entirely maternal. As the film flickered on, I realized the tenderness was also grief for how he'd grown, an ache a mother feels seeing her child step into adulthood and still needing her comfort. Halfway through the movie, he edged closer, his shoulder resting against mine. In the dim living room, his face looked open and trusting. The sight of that trust moved me. My hand reached for his without thinking. He gave my fingers a light squeeze and began to trace small circles on the back of my hand. The gesture was intimate in the way only deep familial love can be, quiet, steady, and without artifice. It stirred emotion in me, but not the kind that demanded alarm. It felt like an affirmation of the bond we'd weathered together. We sat like that for a long while, palms linked and wordless. When the credits rolled, we barely noticed. The movie had become background to the more important business of simply being together. I rested my head on his shoulder and listened to his even breathing. "Mom," he said softly. "Yes," I answered. "I'm really glad you were there last night," he whispered. Those words warmed me more than any blanket. "I'm glad I was," I answered honestly. In that quiet exchange, I felt gratitude for the life we'd built. Years of hard days, of small acts of care, of being there for each other. It was not confusion or anything scandalous. It was recognition and relief that we'd found a refuge in one another. Later, when the dishes were done and the house sank into a gentle hush, we stepped out onto the back porch. The night air was cool and the sky thick with stars. He stood beside me in silence for a while, and it felt full rather than empty. He reached for my hand, and I let him take it. His fingers threaded through mine with the simple need of a son seeking reassurance, and a mother returning it with steadiness. There was no need to interpret the moment beyond what it was. A son saying, without words, "I'm okay when you're here." In the days that followed, that sense of comfort held. Small gestures, a look across the kitchen, a hand resting briefly on my shoulder, easy conversations, reminded me of the strength of our connection. It wasn't some startling new thing so much as the old bond deepening as time and hardship shaped us. Daniel was moving forward into adulthood, and I was learning how to let him, while still offering the closeness he sometimes needed. One rainy afternoon in late autumn, we sat together as storm sounds tapped the windows and a fire made the room amber and slow. Daniel leaned his head on my shoulder, and I smoothed his hair the way I had when he was little, aware now that he was no longer a child. He closed his eyes and sighed, and that familiar tenderness rose in me, gentle, protecting, clear. "Mom," he said after a few quiet minutes, his voice low. I looked down at him. "What is it?" He hesitated, then spoke with the honesty that had always made me trust him. "I know things have been hard. I just want you to know I see everything you've done for me. My throat tightened. You never had to doubt that I love you, I said. He nodded, relief visible on his face, the relief of being understood without qualification. I love you too, he added quietly. I don't say it enough. The sentence laid itself over the room like a soft blanket. I kissed his head and held him a little closer. What settled in me then was not longing or confusion, but peace, the calm that comes when you realize the relationship you've nurtured is solid and true. For the first time in a long while, I could picture a future that felt simple and sure, not dramatic, not fraught, but built on trust and mutual care. He would keep growing, I would keep being here. That steady presence, I understood, was enough.